Hi, everyone. Professor Sackett-Taylor here. This is a two-part video lecture series on Chapter 6 from Principles of Microeconomics on the topic of price controls. We're going to talk about two kinds of price controls in this chapter. The first are price ceilings. We'll talk about why price ceilings matter and what effects they have on overall economic activity. In the second half of this lecture, we'll talk about price floors, what effects they have on overall economic activity, and why they matter. In general, price controls are an attempt by the government to set or manipulate prices by regulating the market. The government can set prices in one of two ways. They can establish legal maximums on prices for a good or service, meaning they can say it's illegal to charge more than a certain price. An example of this that we'll talk about are rent control policies. Or they could set a price floor. This is a legally established minimum price for a good or service. In other words, they can say you could buy or sell this thing at least at this price. We impose ceilings in a market when we think that the natural equilibrium price has a tendency to get too high. This is an intention to help consumers of that product. We impose price floors in a market when the perception is that the price itself, if left alone, would be too low. And this is intended to help producers of that good or service. At this point, what we really want to look at is when are these policies going to be binding, which means when are they going to actually change the behavior of the people in the market? Let's start with price ceilings. So we have three different situations. We have a non-binding price ceiling, a binding price ceiling, and the price ceiling in the long run. I'm going to use graphs on the next three slides to exemplify each of these three situations. In this graph, note that this is a typical supply and demand graph. On the X horizontal axis, we have quantity of bread. On the Y-axis, we have price in dollars per loaf. We have in red this upward sloping supply curve, which tells us based on the law of supply that when a producer of bread can sell that bread at a higher price, there'll be an incentive to supply more and more of it. In other words, price and quantity supplied move in the same positive direction. In blue, we have a downward sloping demand curve. The law of demand tells us that at lower prices, we'll buy more bread. In other words, when price moves in one direction, the quantity demanded moves in the opposite direction. This is what gives us a negative slope or a downward sloping curve. Their point of intersection here is labeled E. This is equilibrium. At equilibrium, we have an associated equilibrium quantity labeled QE and an associated equilibrium price labeled PE. The price in this situation in equilibrium is $1 per loaf of bread. Now, a price ceiling is a legal maximum. You can literally think about the ceiling as in like, I cannot go through it. I can't go above it, right? I hit something that is like up top and I cannot go beyond that. That's a price ceiling. And so here, essentially, when the government sets a price ceiling, there's two places that price ceiling can exist, or really three places in this graph. By chance, the price ceiling could be set at exactly the equilibrium price. It could be set below the equilibrium price, or it could be set above the equilibrium price. So here, imagine a situation. Oh no. I thought I was gonna be able to click through this, my bad. So here, imagine a situation where the government steps in and thinks, bread is getting really expensive. Let's cap it. Let's put a legal maximum on the price of bread. And they come in and they say that the price of bread cannot exceed $2, making that a legal maximum. We're using colors here to represent the fact that meaning any price above $2 is in red because it's illegal. And any price below $2 is in green because it's a go. It's perfectly legal to do that. It's a legal maximum, meaning you just can't go above it. When this price ceiling is set at a price above the equilibrium price, you can see that the equilibrium is in green, meaning that the equilibrium is perfectly legal. And like I said in the last class, when we were talking about surplus, equilibrium is where total surplus is maximized. We are actually really happy in equilibrium, both as buyers and as sellers of a good. And so if the equilibrium is legal, that's where we'll end up. So here, this is what's in what we call a non-binding price ceiling, because it's non-binding, meaning that the policy is not actually going to change our behavior, because our natural behavior would be to be drawn towards equilibrium. And here that's perfectly legal. So we would have gone to equilibrium without this price ceiling. And now we're still going to go to equilibrium even with the price ceiling. That's why it's called non-binding, because it doesn't impact our behavior. We're still able to do what we want to do. However, if that price ceiling is set below the equilibrium price, meaning that everything in red is now illegal, including equilibrium, this is actually going to change our behavior, right? Because now we have to maintain a price in the green zone, but equilibrium isn't there. In the absence of government intervention, we would trend towards equilibrium, but now we can't because it's illegal. So this is called a binding price ceiling, because it's actually going to change the way that we behave in these markets. What's going to happen is, because we want to be in equilibrium, but it's in the red zone, we will go to the very edge of the green zone here, that the price will trend towards being actually equal to that ceiling. But what we notice is that since we cannot go into that red zone, we're not able to reach equilibrium. And when prices are too low, we're in a situation where at that price, the quantity demanded given by the point on the blue curve is going to be much bigger than the quantity supplied, which is the point on the red curve. And so what that means is that we've got more people who want this product than there is product available. This is what we call a shortage. And so anytime we have a binding price ceiling, meaning that it's set below the equilibrium price, making the equilibrium illegal and therefore changing our behavior, the result or the outcome of this tends to be a shortage in this market. In the long run, we talked about in chapter 4 of elasticity, how elasticity is essentially a measure of sensitivity or a measure of flexibility, even like how responsive we are to changes in prices. And we know that the more time we have to consider other options, the more flexible we are, or the more responsive we are. And so things tend to be more elastic in the long run. This applies to elasticity of supply and elasticity of demand. The way that we know a curve is more elastic in the long run is that it tends to get flatter when we look at it over a long period of time. And so if both of these curves are flatter, reflecting the fact that demand and supply are both more elastic in the long run, that means that this shortage actually gets bigger over time. So if we have a shortage in the short run, like in the next week or the next month, due to a price ceiling, it's not going to go away over time. It doesn't make itself better. In fact, if anything, it gets worse over time, because in the long run, we have very elastic buying and selling behavior. And so those shortages will be exacerbated over time. In other words, they get worse. So practicing what we know, if you're asked what the effect of a non-binding price ceiling is, you can select C here. There is no effect. What that means to be non-binding is that the price ceiling does not inhibit us from reaching equilibrium, and that's where we would want to go anyway. So this is a law or a policy that doesn't actually change our natural behavior, and therefore no effect. But if the price ceiling is binding, what is one function that a black market might serve? What we do know about binding price ceilings is that the price ceiling is going to be set below the equilibrium price. And so since prices are too low, we end up with a shortage, a situation where demand exceeds supply. That's where the black market comes in. Oftentimes, items that are not available on above ground or legal markets become available in illegal or black markets. And so black markets may actually work to reduce shortages as the result of a price ceiling. Finally, we know that supply and demand generally become more elastic in the long run. This means that the shortages that are caused by price ceilings actually become larger in the long run, not smaller. And that's because more elastic demand and more elastic supply is reflected in the graph by flatter curves, meaning those 2 points get spread out further away from one another. The example of a price ceiling that we're going to talk about in this class is rent control. Rent control is a situation where certain apartment buildings, or they're usually apartment buildings, maybe condos or housing of some sort, are set aside as government housing, and the government imposes a price ceiling on them, meaning they say that there's a maximum price that can actually be charged for that housing rental. You may, if any of you have watched Friends, there's an episode where Monica, says something about how her apartment with Rachel is so amazing and they could never actually afford it. The only reason they have it is because it's rent controlled. So besides shortages, meaning that under rent control, there's going to be more people that want access to those apartments than there are apartments available. There'll be a natural housing shortage. But besides shortages, can you think of any other consequences of such a policy? Well, one thing is that because the landlords of these apartments know that there's like basically a line out the door waiting for the apartment, they don't have to work as hard to keep the quality of the apartment up, that they know that they'll rent it even if the quality goes down. So there's often a reduction in the quality of items when there are shortages. So that either means less maintenance overall or just a long term until there is maintenance again, kind of general decay. This is the meaning of, like, in many international cities, there are areas that are called slums. And these slums are often areas where the rent is very low and the landlords have not really maintained them properly. Other unintended consequences of rent control might be landlords trying to nickel and dime their tenants by charging them additional fees in order to make up the difference in the revenue that they perceive themselves losing from such a low rent. They may actually decrease long-term investment in building new units because there's not really a high profitability for the people that invest. And so often what happens, we actually see lots of housing discrimination, because if you know that there's always going to be another person knocking down the door wanting to rent that apartment, a landlord, although if found out, could get in a lot of trouble because it is illegal, a landlord could start making some kind of rules about who gets those apartments. And those rules are not always overboard, if you know what I mean. So these policies often end up hurting the people that it was supposed to help, the low-income people that we believe deserve access to housing. But unfortunately, the incentives involved with this kind of policy control create perverse outcomes, or outcomes that are unintended consequences. In the long run, we can see that right, the demand curve in the long run, DLR, is much flatter than the demand curve in the short run, DSR. And the supply curve in the long run, SLR, is much flatter than the supply curve in the short run, SSR. And so when we're thinking about shortage, a shortage in the short run, you can see, is much smaller than the shortage that will happen in the long run. And that's due to elasticities. In the next video, I'll pick up with price floors and we'll talk about an example that you are very familiar with, the minimum wage. I'll see you next time.